Welcome to Unlapped. We're back after a great Canadian Grand Prix that gave us plenty of overtakes and entertaining racing. Katie, George, Laurence Edmondson. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, please hit us with a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, because we greatly appreciate it. Laz, let's get into it. You were there in Canada on the ground. It was exciting as hell as a fan watching on television. What was it like seeing it unfold in person?
Well, the exciting thing about Canada is whenever you go there, you can never guarantee the weather. And we know that you had a bit of rain to a race, and all of a sudden it becomes a lot more exciting. So the morning of it, we were watching the weather forecast. The FIA actually supply us with the same weather radar that the teams get. So you can see these banks of rain coming in. And of course, you can look out the window or go outside and see the banks of rain coming in. So we're like, one of these just has to hit at the right time, and it's going to be good. And there was this downpour ahead of the race. And so stood on the grid, watching the cars come on. It was clear they were starting on some sort of wet tires. And therefore we knew it was going to be exciting right from the very start. And then I found it gripping the whole way through. I mean, the way we watch it in the media center is probably fairly similar to how most people watch it at home. We have a screen, and then we have timing screens as well. Depends on your kind of geek level as to whether you set up your own timing screens at home, but we have those there. And then, I use the F1 app as well. It's a good way to keep an eye on different gaps and so on. But throughout that, you just didn't know. You couldn't say at any point who was going to come out and win this race, even when Max Verstappen got in the lead. And usually, as we know from recent F1, that's a sign that Max Verstappen is going to win the race. Even though he went on to do it, you didn't know for certain at any point throughout it what might happen, what might be one last twist in the tail. So I feel like actually Max won it without the fastest car. And probably, that's a little bit of payback for Miami. But no, I think it was a thrilling race to watch.
Did you, yes or no, remember your rain jacket, unlike Nate Saunders?
I did remember my rain jacket. So, fully prepared. I don't know what I would have done without it, to be honest, because it rained a lot throughout the whole weekend. At one point on Friday, prior to first practice, I was down at Mercedes. There was a James Allison, he's their technical director, James Allison media session. He was just talking us through the latest updates to the car and the progress they've been making. All very interesting stuff. Interrupted halfway through by this hailstorm, to the point that in Canada, the team hospitalities are tents. So you have all this hail like raining down on top of the tent. So all of our audio recordings were pretty much useless. And it was so bad, in fact, it got Lewis Hamilton out from his driver room to come out into the main hospitality and take a look at the door, and basically then tell the rest of us, guys, you got to leave now. I've got something going on here in 10 minutes. You guys have got to get out of it. So yeah, typical Lewis Hamilton hospitality there. But no, he was joking around. It was great. It was great. So with that kind of weather in the area, like there was no guarantees as what was going to happen, or if we were going to get a race, because of course red flags are the enemy often when we're going racing in the wet, and fortunately we didn't have any of those on Sunday.
I'm glad you mentioned Mercedes, because they performed as a team extremely well on the weekend. Last episode, I poked fun a little bit at Mercedes because we haven't talked about them on Unlapped in quite some time. And quite frankly, they haven't warranted being talked about because their results have been decently poor for most of this season. McLaren, I think at this point, we could come to expect maybe this consistency with both drivers and the car that they've put together, the way that they're driving. But what impressed you overall from Mercedes this weekend? Because this was kind of a night and day difference from what we've seen.
It was. And Mercedes have been working slowly behind the scenes. And I don't think perhaps have got the credit they deserve, because while they've made small little steps over the last few races, the likes of McLaren and Ferrari have made big steps. So even though Mercedes have been making progress, they haven't quite had that last little bit they need to really go and compete with the likes of McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari right at the very front. But in Monaco, they brought this new front wing, and it was only on George's car because there was only one wing in existence. So it could only go on one car. It went on George's car, and it had a good impact on it. But again, in Monaco, as we talked about in recent podcasts, if you qualify further back, you're not getting forward. So it didn't really show its true potential. But then come to Canada, all of a sudden, everything seemed to set up quite nicely for the team. They quickly got a car that was set up well. They only really had one dry practice session on Saturday morning, but they quickly seemed to nail that. And one of the peculiarities about the Montreal circuit is while it's very high speed, there's some very long straights and the cars get well over 200 miles per hour. Most of the corners are slow speed, so you only have one type of corner. And one of the biggest issues Mercedes have faced this year is getting a car that works in a high speed corner, but then also works in a low speed corner. So as soon as they found they've got it just right in a high speed one, they get into a low speed corner and they're dealing with a lot of understeer. And then if they get that understeer out of low speed corners, they get into high speed corners and it's been twitchy. But these upgrades they've been bringing have been working specifically on that, bringing stability to the car. The front wing, the new front wing just seemed to be the last final touch to that. And now what they're talking about and why there's this excitement is that they feel like they've got this more secure platform to go racing with, where the car isn't going to do things that they don't want it to. And once you have that platform, you can then add more performance on top. So in Spain, in a week's time, they've got a new floor coming, which they're hopeful is actually going to add performance again. So I think really positive for Mercedes, but until we get to a circuit where there's that range and variety of corner types, we can't say for certain they're back or they're on a McLaren level or a Ferrari level or anything like that.
Does Spain provide that kind of circuit to see the versatility?
It absolutely does. And that's the reason why Red Bull are quite eager to get back to the European circuits coming up, because they're all permanent circuits where you don't quite have the same amount of bumps as you do at street circuits like Monaco, to some extent in Canada. And you don't have to ride the curbs as much like you do in Monaco and Canada, again, because they're slow speed corners. There's a lot of advantage to cutting over a curb, but it unsettles the car and it asks a lot of the suspension. And right now, the Red Bull, when it's been going over those kind of corners, the suspension has been found lacking. It hasn't had the answers, to what it needs to get over those curbs, whereas some of the other cars have. So we go to Barcelona, curbs are a bit flatter and the corners are a big range of mainly high speed, but there's a couple of low speed ones there as well, and a few medium speed. And then that will give us more answers as to who's got a really well-rounded package, probably Red Bull, and who's still kind of working towards that, making progress.
When you look at the dynamic between the drivers, George seemed to get the better of Lewis in Montreal. He started the day on pole, obviously, and then he even overtook Lewis to get back into P3 position. Lewis, I think we can all agree, was frustrated falling back into P4 because the team had put him on hard tires when he had requested that he stay or get on softs. How do you foresee this dynamic with these two? I know obviously Lewis is going to Ferrari in half a year's time now, but how do you foresee this dynamic playing out between the two as we move throughout the season?
Well, that does add a certain element to it, the fact that Lewis is leaving at the end of the season. And while I don't think Mercedes, if you go into some of the darker areas of Twitter and Reddit and so on right now, you'll find a lot of fans with these theories about how Mercedes are trying to screw over Lewis. I don't think that's true whatsoever. Mercedes have no interest whatsoever right now in hampering or hamstringing one of their cars. Why would they? At the moment, they're struggling to get podiums, regularly. So they don't want to start creating issues.
Self-sabotaging.
Yeah, exactly. But there will be a case where you'll have situations where there'll be a better part or a part with a younger life on it, or any number of things, because it's impossible to make two Formula One cars exactly the same. And naturally, whereas perhaps previously that probably would have gone to Lewis throughout his whole time at Mercedes, now perhaps some of that might be going towards George. But that is the nature of the situation there right now. But I don't think it's going to be enough to have massive swings in performance either way. But it's kind of refreshing as well to see that Mercedes are still happy to let their drivers race flat out. They were on slightly different strategies, like you say. They ended up on, when one was on medium tires, everyone was on hard, and vice versa. And I don't think necessarily that Lewis's strategy was that much worse. He actually set the fastest lap of the race using those hard tires on the final lap, a fraction faster than George. But I think how that ends up, like, no matter what happens in it, people are going to look for reasons to say this is Mercedes sabotaging Lewis or whatever. I absolutely don't think that's the case. But undoubtedly, both of those drivers, it's going to be their last season together. Both of them want to come out on top. Now, where Mercedes have to be careful is that rivalry between the two drivers doesn't spill over into lost results. Because if you look at what happened in Canada, if they were to run that weekend again, they'd have a very, very good chance of winning it because their car was so quick round that track. And remarkably, because we've very rarely had to say this about Mercedes, certainly while Lewis has been there, the thing that was lacking over the course of the weekend was the drivers. You know, if you look at the potential they had at certain parts in qualifying, they didn't actually translate that into Q3. You know, if Lewis had done the same lap that he did in Q2, in Q3, he would have been on pole position, clear of George Russell and Max Verstappen on identical times. And the same is true as George. He did a quicker lap in Q2 as well. So there were a number of occasions where the drivers made mistakes. George made a lot during that race, you know, enough that I think it's fair to say he threw away the race. So they have to be careful that now that they are getting back into a position that they've worked so hard all these years to get there, that the drivers are able to capitalize. Can capitalize on it. And it does feel strange saying that about Lewis Hamilton because he's done that so many times. And also in the past, he's had a car that perhaps wasn't capable of getting a result and he's got one. So, you know, we're not just going to judge him on this one race, but I think, yeah, Merc have to be a little bit careful. One, that their drivers, you know, are not basically getting it right, not making mistakes, but also that any rivalry there or any desire to finish ahead of each other in this final year of teammates doesn't take away from the ultimate team result.
I also too wonder, like, the psyche of it as a driver when you know you don't have a car capable of winning, if that makes you a little bit less mentally sharp, right? Because you know that you're not going to be able to get the results regardless of what you do. And now that they do have the car, I wonder if they just as drivers need to sharpen up just a little bit more, and maybe they can, you know, get the optimal results out of the car and as both drivers. I mean, we know how good both of them are, especially Lewis Hamilton, that goes without saying, but it'd be curious to see if they can build on this momentum in Spain with the upgrades that they're going to continue to bring. And then throughout the season, a team that had all the momentum in the world that seemed to watch it slip away was Ferrari. I mean, both drivers were out in Q2. Neither driver made it to the final checkered flag, both finishing with DNFs. Like, what went wrong for Ferrari in Montreal? Because I felt like they were trending in the right direction and everybody was so excited about that way that they were heading.
Well, in the words of Fred Vasseur, everything went wrong. You know, that's what he said on Sunday when we asked him. And, you know, I think there was an element of, you know, bad luck in the race. Leclerc had an issue with his engine, which was the reason he had to pit for so long. And that's why they put him on slick tires, even though the rain was coming down and it was obvious to everyone that it was the wrong tire. It was one last gamble because the race had already gone. But what it boils down to was a lack of performance already in qualifying. The car just wasn't fast enough. They ended up missing out on the cut for Q3. There was some suggestion that maybe they could have gone use their soft tires differently. I actually don't think they could. I think given the allocation they had and what they'd used in Q1, they actually used them as the correct way, as you would expect, because there was a chance of rain at the end of the session. So yeah, I feel like the main thing that was lacking throughout was performance. Why? I couldn't say, because we did this podcast prior to the Montreal Grand Prix and we were all saying how Ferrari, I think we all had them in the top three. I had them as a 1-2. You know, everyone seemed to think going into this race that the car was going to be quick, and it's really hard to pick apart why it wasn't. They didn't have the 2 practice sessions you'd usually get on the Friday in the dry, so they were in the wet, and it seems like they just didn't ever get into a position where they could turn the tires on, get them into the right temperature window to then get a good lap out of them. There was an expectation that that wouldn't be such a big issue in the race. But then, of course, Charles Leclerc had his problem and Carlos just seemed to, you know, really struggle as well. So, yeah, just as we've had some surprise results where, say, the Red Bull hasn't performed as we'd expect, this was one where the Ferrari was just lacking. So we'll have to get to Spain and see if the team have any further answers on that and whether they can basically refine the setup to make sure it does work at a circuit like Spain.
Someone else who had a disappointing weekend was Sergio Perez. And I sometimes find him to be an enigma because he signs his contract extension. Red Bull obviously wants to remain loyal to him. And then he turns around and qualifies P16, didn't finish the race on Sunday. This comes after, I think, a lackluster performance in Monaco. And to make matters worse, he was hit with a 3-place grid penalty for taking his damaged car back into the pits. I don't want to ask, I mean, like, the normal question, I think the easiest question is it a mistake for Red Bull to extend Checo? I think that's too harsh, though. But why does it seem like he goes in peaks and valleys of these lulls, right? Like, he's super consistent one weekend, and then the next weekend he can't follow it up.
Yeah, and we've also seen this around contract time for Checo as well, where he'll be very good before he signs a contract. And then coincidence or otherwise, I mean, I don't really want to point fingers, but it does seem like he kind of drops the ball a bit afterwards. And I've even heard members of Red Bull joke about that. I think Christian Horner actually said it in a press conference around China time, because then Checo was looking particularly solid, and somebody asked him, what's changed with Checo this year? Why is he so good? And Christian said, well, he hasn't signed a contract yet, so maybe that's it. So, I mean, that does tally, but I don't think that's, a satisfactory answer for why a driver would lose so much performance. I think the reality is that the Red Bull really has had its weaknesses shown up from Imola through Monaco and into Canada. Again, huge credit to Max Verstappen for being able to drive around that. I mean, even he struggled with it in Monaco, but in Montreal, again, going back to what I said earlier, I don't think he had the fastest car, but he still won the race. And so Checo, it seems, when the car is that bit more difficult, when it's running up against its limitations, when it has to be taken beyond where it's comfortable, that seems to be where he really struggles. But he is also up against someone who is exceptional in Max Verstappen. And, perhaps that is the difference. But I don't think it entirely excuses Checo's result in Montreal. Qualifying was just a complete disaster. He said as much. And then, didn't make much progress in the race until he finally found the wall. And then, of course, there was a controversy over whether he should have driven it back, which is why he has this free place penalty. And the reason he did that was because Red Bull desperately didn't want a safety car at the end of that race, because Max was out and cruising at that point at the front, and a safety car is one last chance for teams to take a gamble. And of course, the Mercedes already have fresh tires behind, so perhaps it would have given them an advantage. So that was a little bit naughty, because the rear wing was clearly damaged beyond repair. There wasn't a huge amount to gain by getting the car back to the garage, other than making sure there isn't a safety car. And of course, in doing that, and this is what the stewards were upset about, he ran the risk of leaving debris over the track, which obviously is dangerous. And I don't know if anyone picked up on it, but there was a McLaren radio call where McLaren asked Lando about the state of the track, and he said, yeah, there's loads of debris all over it, knowing full well, of course, that a safety car would have been beneficial for him. So it works both ways. But yeah, I think for Red Bull to do that, it was a bit naughty. And I think this 3-place grid penalty is a right measurement of punishment for doing that.
I think one of my favorite radio messages of the season was McLaren's in Miami of, hey, Oscar, Lando's leading the race. Whatever you do, do not cause a safety car, which I felt like obviously Red Bull was operating under the same circumstances in Montreal. There was unfortunately more drama for Alpine this weekend. I'm just curious what you made of the situation between Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. Did you feel like it was politics at play? We know that Esteban will be leaving Alpine at the end of the season, or did you think it was just pure strategy, them asking Ocon to let Gasly through so that he could then attack and overtake Daniel Ricciardo, which ended up not happening anyways?
Yeah, so it's still a very charged environment there, emotionally charged environment, because I think while Esteban is ready to leave Alpine at the end of the year, and Alpine are ready to see the back of Esteban, of course, they still have to work together for the rest of this year. And of course, Esteban still wants to prove to the rest of the grid, the rest of the world, that he's a good driver and he deserves a seat. So you can understand why, these points we're talking about, 9th and 10th place, 2 points and 1 point, but it's still worth a huge amount at the end of the year when people go back, because when people look at a points tally, they don't tend to remember the exact ins and outs of how everyone came about. So you can understand why Esteban really wanted to hold on to that 9th place. And in fact, he was running 8th until lap 67, but his car had developed an issue with its battery where it couldn't fully recharge the battery, which means it couldn't fully deploy the battery, which meant he was down on power. And that saw him lose that place to Ricciardo. Once he'd lost that place to Ricciardo, he had Gasly behind him, who was looking pretty good on, I think, a set of hard tires. And so the team asked them to swap so that Gasly could have a go at trying to attack Ricciardo. Now, by the time Esteban agreed to that, it was realistically too late for Gasly to do it. So it would have actually been, if Esteban were to play the full team game, he would have done it straight away when he was initially asked. Was Gasly ever going to get past? Possibly not. You know, I mean, it was a lot to ask. But then, of course, they didn't then swap the positions back, which is what Esteban felt he had agreed to. But if you go back and listen to the radio, his engineer never actually said that. He said, I'm working on that. So it was never promised to him that the positions would get swapped back. But obviously, in Esteban's head, he deserved that position back and that extra point, which, you know, again, in these very fine margins of points tallies, might be worth something at the end of the year in terms of his championship position. So, you know, add on top all of that, the drama of Monaco, the coming together, the announcement in between, and you just end up with an incredibly messy situation where Esteban was clearly very upset after the race, and the team, you know, kind of felt, well, we got the same amount of points anyway. They got points, which for Alpine this year is a big deal. And and I think they felt that maybe Esteban was overreacting a bit, but it's a tricky situation, and it's not getting, you know, things like that aren't going to make it any easier. But I think it was just a unfortunate set of events that led to it, because if Esteban hadn't had that issue on his car, then he probably would have been able to hold off Daniel Ricciardo, and then he would have finished 8th and Pierre would have probably been 10th and Ricciardo would have been 9th. So, you know, I think it's just unfortunate the way it all came together. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this in other sports, Katie, where teams just start to implode, and even when you know the situation's bad, events transpire that it just gets worse. I don't know whether that's common in the sports you cover as well.
It's different because there's never just two teammates, right?
Sure.
And it's so pointed between the two. Usually you have a couple bad eggs, right, that cause drama, or they're a cancer within a locker room, but you have the masses to be able to work through that, right? And you can weed those players or athletes out. This is what makes, I think, this sport and dynamic of the sport so unbelievably unique, because the two teammates, while they're teammates and they're supposed to be working together for the betterment of the team, they're also each other's direct competition, which is why I freaking love this sport. I don't see it in any other sport that I cover, quite frankly.
Yeah, it's a great dynamic, isn't it? I think it's one of the things that Netflix has latched onto as well.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Sometimes arguably over
Too much
slightly in using some of the quotes that are around and about, but it is this fascinating dynamic, and I think we never fully know the situation in the teams between the two drivers at any one point. And also, I think sometimes the teams don't fully understand, you know, exactly what's going on inside some of the drivers' heads, because it's all well and good when you're sat in a briefing room 2 hours before the race and you're discussing what tyre you're going to take if it's a perfectly dry race, and, you know, everything goes to plan. When all of that goes out the window and the rain's coming down and the rear of the car is sliding around and these drivers are doing 220 miles per hour, inches from each other, you know, and inches from the walls, then everything changes, doesn't it? And all of those best intentions that may have been laid out before just go out the window. And you're right, that rivalry between the two drivers can just become so intense. So yeah, no, I'm glad you point that out. It's so true. And I think absolutely in the case of the Alpine situation,
No doubt.
that's the case.
You mentioned Daniel Ricciardo, and I feel like he was answering questions before the weekend started that he probably didn't foresee. Former champion Jacques Villeneuve had this to say about Daniel Ricciardo. Why is he still in F1? Why? We are hearing the same thing now for the last 4 or 5 years. We have to make the car better for him. For him. If you can't cut it, go home. There's someone else to take your place. There's no reason to keep going and to keep finding excuses. Okay. Ricciardo obviously heard about these comments. He then responded by qualifying in P5, and he finished the race in the points in P8. After his performance, Laz, do you think Villeneuve's comments hold any merit?
So I think there is a little bit of truth in what Jacques saying. I think it's really harsh. Like, you know, I think it's laid out in the harshest possible terms. But there is this, you know, thing where with Daniel Ricciardo, because there was a little bit more to that quote as well, where he went through all the different teammates he's been up against. And obviously against Lando Norris at McLaren, he really struggled. He's never quite looked comfortable since coming back with AlphaTauri and now RB. And so I think there is still this question mark over Daniel Ricciardo of, you know, what's he got left to give to F1? What's he really, you know, going to be able to achieve? Because of course, when he came back with AlphaTauri after that Red Bull tyre test, the idea was, right, he's going to get back up to speed with AlphaTauri. We're going to give him the environment he wants again. And then he's going to be a possible replacement for Checo Perez. Now, now we know Perez has a 2-year contract with Red Bull. You're like, okay, well, maybe Red Bull don't think that's, a serious option anymore. So what does that mean? Does that mean he stays in RB, a team that realistically is never probably going to fight for wins just because of the nature of being a second team behind Red Bull? And, even podiums are going to be hard to come by. He's certainly not going to be fighting for championships there. So you start to wonder whether some of what Jacques is saying is right, because maybe the raw performance just isn't there. And look, I like Ricciardo. I think he still brings a huge amount to F1, to the team. I still think, on the basis of what we saw here in qualifying, and then also what we saw in Miami, where he qualified P4 in the sprint race, there is still something there. And the frustration is, in fact, that he can't access it all the time. So I would absolutely like to give him till the end of the year to see what he can do, and whether he's got, the potential to step it up. And if that is the case, is RB the right place for him going forward, or should he go somewhere else? The other interesting thing to all this is that we were kind of expecting that Ricciardo would remain at RB because, aside from the fact he is a very, very capable racing driver, I think when we talk about F1 drivers, we're talking at such a high level that even if somebody thinks they're not good enough to be an F1, doesn't mean they're a bad driver. It just means they're not quite at the very top level. But anyway, I think he is still F1 level driver. So we were kind of expecting, because of that and because of his personality, that he would be probably the first driver to be announced at RB. And then perhaps Liam Lawson might be the next one. Okay. And Yuki Tsunoda might be the driver looking for a seat next year. Not the case. On Saturday, RB announced Tsunoda for another season, took up the option that they had on him, which was actually preventing Tsunoda from making much kind of progress with other teams and negotiations with other teams, but obviously secures his future for next year. But now we have this big question, Ricciardo or Liam Lawson? And when you look at it like that, you have, it's a tough one. I honestly don't know which of them is a better driver, because Lawson replaced Ricciardo last year, so they never were actually teammates at AlphaTauri. Lawson did a great job in the few races he had, but Ricciardo has shown some real brilliance at other times. The only other way you look at it is that, well, Lawson is this young driver with huge potential and a whole career ahead of him. Ricciardo's at the other end of his career, where probably his greatest achievements are behind him, and there's that question of where he goes next. So I find that fascinating in this whole Daniel Ricciardo debate. And by the way, that news was announced after Jacques Villeneuve had spoken about Ricciardo. So I find it fascinating to know where Ricciardo ends up. I mean, Katie, your gut feeling, you've seen Lawson in the car, you've seen Ricciardo in the car. I'm going to put you in a spot on a horrible question and say, which way would you go?
Well, I think there's multiple factors to consider, right? If Daniel Ricciardo continues to put together results like we saw in Montreal on a more consistent basis for the remainder of the season, then I think you stick with Daniel Ricciardo because of all that he brings from a marketing standpoint, from a brand standpoint. And to Villeneuve's comments, like, part of the reason he's still in the sport, regardless of the poor results over multiple years in a row, is his brand ability. I mean, he's one of the most recognizable sports athletes in the world, right? I mean, he's more recognizable than some of the more the better drivers on the grid because of his personality. We've talked about that. And I think that has a lot of advantages for a team like RB, who's committed so much to rebranding, committed to kind of trying to carve out their own niche away from Red Bull being a sister team. Now, Liam Lawson, in terms of committing to his future, does he have more upside? I think absolutely, just given his age, given what we've seen from the consistency every time we've seen him on the grid. I just wish we could see him more. And I could understand the frustration of a young driver when you look at maybe somebody like Daniel Ricciardo that isn't providing the results on a week in, week out basis, but is being stuck in the car because of what he brings from a marketability standpoint. Like, if I'm Liam Lawson, I just want somebody to give me a shot. And I think that's frustrating, having to wait in the wings time and time again for these young drivers when these teams continue to stick with some of the older veteran drivers at this point.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing with Lawson as well, Nate managed to dig this up earlier this year, that if Red Bull don't take up the contract with him, so basically by keeping him or giving him a race seat at RB, he's free to look elsewhere. So it'll almost act as a termination of his Red Bull contract. That's our understanding of it. Now, that's interesting in a way, because you think that's great, he could go out and, find a seat somewhere else. But actually, the other seats are quite competitive. There's a lot of good drivers out there who still don't have contracts for next year. and increasingly fewer and fewer seats. So I wonder whether Red Bull are just going to, sit on this and wait and wait and wait and see how Ricciardo performs. Like you say, whether he can replicate what he did in Canada and in Miami sprint qualifying, whether he can start to build up some momentum and then make a decision. Because they kind of know that while Lawson will have extra freedom at some point this year to go and look at his other options, whether those options are actually that realistic is another question. And then, of course, they can always say to him, look, Liam, sorry, we couldn't make it happen this year, but here's another reserve contract for another year. And perhaps, in 26, when, maybe Tsunoda's on the move again then, because I think the current extension of his deal, the option that was taken up was just 1 year. Maybe then Lawson will finally get into the seat. But it's very interesting, and it at some point it just always becomes really brutal. And drivers who you want to see succeed and you want to see get a chance in Formula One either don't, or if they do, there's this huge amount of pressure on them to perform. So certainly one to watch and how that all plays out. But hey, as for now, Ricciardo did everything he could, I think, to get a very solid result. Remember, Tsunoda was running very well in the Canadian Grand Prix up until the point he spun out. So, it does go to show that I think that Ricciardo's still got something to offer. He's still kind of, operating on a similar level to Yuki Tsunoda, who a few years ago you might have said, well, that's not enough. But now I think Tsunoda is actually becoming respected within F1 as a really good benchmark driver.
Do you remember a time where there was this much talent waiting in the wings and not enough seats for these guys to get opportunity? Like, I feel like we're in a really interesting time in the sport because there are so many young, talented drivers that don't have seats and maybe won't for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that have come together. We do tend to get these waves of talent from junior categories. The last one I remember was Lando Norris, George Russell, and Alex Albon. And initially, it looked like Albon wasn't going to get his break in Formula One. He before he was signed up to go into Toro Rosso, he had a contract in Formula E, and it looked like that was the way his career was going, which seemed like a great shame at the time. But it did kind of also feel like Norris and Russell were the two real picks from that wave of talent, and therefore, you couldn't really get around it. But fortunately, something opened up for him. So there is often the case that drivers just have to wait that a little bit longer, and then they get their chance. But yeah, to have this, I think there's a number of reasons for it. One is that we do have a lot of drivers knocking on the door. Thinking of Oliver Bearman, Kimi Antonelli, obviously Liam Lawson, Jack Doohan's another one, Alpine. But then you also have a lot of drivers, experienced drivers who are still very, very good in Formula One. And I think, compared to certainly 20 years ago, the longevity of careers has been extended significantly. I mean, Fernando Alonso going as long as he is, well into his 40s. Lewis Hamilton about to go into his 40s. Like we had the Michael Schumacher example about 10 years ago, but there aren't that many examples prior to that where drivers would race that long into their careers. So there's probably more turnover there. And then, of course, we go back to this fact that there are only 20 seats, 10 teams. And unless you have Andretti come on, which is looking increasingly unlikely right now, then that's always going to be the case. And it's always going to be up against it. The good thing about the situation now is that I don't think there's a single driver in F1 who doesn't deserve to be there. And certainly looking next year, when we know it looks like increasingly unlikely, say someone like Logan Sargent's going to be there, Zhou Guanyu's going to have his work cut out to get into F1. I think those are actually two very talented drivers, but the fact that it almost looks impossible for them to get a seat just shows you the level of talent there is. And I think that's the only good thing we can take from this scenario is that, hey, look, at least the drivers on the grid are all exceptionally talented, aren't there just because of their money, which, again, if you go back 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was often the case.
It's going to be interesting to see what the driver lineup looks like in 2026, which currently on ESPN.com, you have the regulations outlined in your article. And you also have many of the concerns that were raised within the first 24 hours of the regulations being announced for 2026. Teams seem to be concerned that the cars will be too slow and that the rules are too restrictive. What did you make of A, the regulations, and B, some of the comments and worries that teams and drivers were voicing in Montreal?
Well, I think this is a whole other podcast we could do, probably will do at some point, the closer we get to it. But it is worth touching on because it was one of the main talking points prior to the race. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The main concern is that with the regulations as they are now, they're not actually signed off yet. We've just been given a taste of what's in them, but the teams have seen draft regulations. And with what we have now, if you put that in simulations, the cars are going to be incredibly slow. Probably about 2 or 3 seconds faster than a Formula 2 car was James Vowles' expectations, having seen examples run in.
I trust him. He's like Rain Man.
He is, yeah, exactly. I mean, I would absolutely trust him on anything to do with lap times. So yeah, I think that is a concern because right now, the F1 cars are considerably faster, 7-8 seconds faster. So we're looking at a significant drop in lap time. And then also the way that lap time is generated, well, the cars are much slower through the corners and they're going to be faster on the straights. But the FIA have said, look, we're going to have to be careful about how fast they go on the straights because there's a point where you're running at 250 miles per hour around somewhere like Baku or Jeddah, and it becomes very dangerous. And the FIA have made clear, because that was one of the concerns raised by George Russell immediately afterwards, that no, we're going to keep a cap on speeds. We know how to do that. We can do that by tailoring some of the way the battery uses its power towards the end of straights, and also the active aero, they can put restrictions in there. So, that will have an impact on straight line speeds. But ultimately, it seems like the cars are going to be quite a bit slower. And a lot of this is really because the future engines, the 2026 engines, the challenge Formula One has set the engineers to have an engine that is 50% petrol powered, 50% electric battery powered is so tough with the technology we have right now that actually you're having to basically turn these cars a little bit into like Frankensteins, with different things opening up to help reduce drag, to ease the limitations of the engines. And I think that's the kind of concern that a lot of teams and drivers have, is that while these engines are great because it is going to be very impressive for a Formula One engine producing 1,000 brake horsepower to have nearly half of that from electric power. And it's going to be great to have sustainable fuels that you'll be able to take out of the Formula One car and drop in your road car and have a zero carbon net footprint as a result. That is really cool stuff that is very important for a number of reasons. But if it starts to limit what the cars are capable of doing and the type of racing we have, there's this wider question of, well, is this really where Formula One should be going? And ultimately, I think what we're heading towards is a situation where the FIA produce a set of regulations that no team is happy with. And then we go through a period of various concessions being granted to make these cars, to give the engineers a little bit more flexibility to make them faster. So perhaps a little bit more freedom within the regulations to do various stuff. And perhaps, some things that help solve some of the issues that the drivers have raised. And the FIA say that they've kind of gone in with a really strong hand of negotiation in that they've made these rules super restrictive right now, in the knowledge that they're probably going to have to row back a bit. But they've done that because they have these objectives with the engines and with the type of racing they want to see. So that when the teams start to nibble back here and there, they're starting from a low point, and therefore, they don't all of a sudden spiral out of control even before we've seen a car hit the track. That's the theory behind it. I think the reality is a lot of political wrangling over the next few months and then into next year when the regulations are set, because the teams have started working on the cars aerodynamically. A real big question mark over a few of these things, how the racing is going to be, and also how competitive it's going to be, because we know from recent experience, change the regulations as they did in 2022, and it's not unusual for one team to get a big advantage. And I think that's another big concern going into this set of regs. When
do they have to be set in stone?
So the plan right now is for it to be signed off by the World Motorsport Council, which is the FIA's, World Motorsport Council is what it says. That's by June 28th. If it goes beyond June 30th, the end of this month, then you end up in a slightly awkward position where the FIA can no longer unilaterally set the regulations. They then have to go into a process whereby everything goes through the F1 Commission, which includes Formula One itself, although Formula One have backed the FIA with all this, and the teams. And so as soon as you start bringing the teams into decisions about future regulations, you hit issues because, funnily enough, these teams have their own agendas, most of which are based around them being competitive at a future date. Therefore, you can quite easily get into silly arguments over stuff that should be settled by the governing body. But the FIA have up until the end of this month, the end of June, to get it set. After that, then you start to get into this slightly tricky and muddy area of allowing the teams some say in the regulations. I think what we will get is a set of regulations that, like I said, no one's happy with by June 28th. And then after that, I think we'll see some tweaks along the way as the teams start to really get stuck into it and start to realize this is an issue, the sort of which we can't really live with. And then
my money's on that option.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is with F1, with a set of regulations, you're never going to get a situation where everyone's happy. It's just not possible because there'll always be winners and losers. So when you have a situation where everyone is a little bit upset, it usually means you've reached a good middle ground. But of course, what we don't want is cars that are running out of power halfway down the straight, one of the concerns going forward. And also what we don't want is cars that either can't race or in some way look slightly ridiculous racing because the overtakes are too easy or impossibly hard. I think all of those things with the regulations that are set out at the moment could be genuine concerns going forward. And that's the stuff that the FIA really has to get on top of and iron out.
As always, I appreciate your analysis. Enjoy your time off. Everybody wish Nate Saunders well. He's currently on jury duty, and that's why he's not here. But allegedly, he will be done and on his way to Spain when we get ready for Barcelona. We'll be back next week with another episode of Unlapped. Cheers.